Well, we're continuing with lesson 21 in that God's chosen people ask for a king. And we got right down to the parts that we haven't gone over yet. And it was, here, Moses and the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses misrepresents God as saying God was angry when he strikes the rock twice. And so God says, Moses, I'm not going to allow you to go into the promised land. It must have been pretty sad for Moses. But as Moses stood up on Mount Pisgah and looked over and said, God, do you think I could go in? He said, don't ask me again. But we know as we look into the future from that time that Moses stood on the Mount of Transfiguration face to face with Jesus. Moses loved God and he wanted to see him face to face. And he got to, we know that. But then again, how did Israel get into the promised land? Well, we know the story of the spies I told you. And as to the spies, they were sent into the promised land. And they brought back huge bushels of grapes and all kinds of things that were growing there. And they said how magnificent the promised land was. But there were giants in the promised land. And they thought, oh, we don't want to go in there. It's too scary. Well, 10 of them gave that bad report. But 2, we know, Caleb and Joshua said, oh, but God is in charge. And if God leads us, he's going to protect us. He's going to guide us. And he is all powerful. And so they went into the promised land with Joshua. But the generation of Moses had passed away, and only those under, 20 years of age were survived to go into the promised land. But Joshua, and my next card was Joshua. Joshua takes them into the promised land. And he first meets in Jericho, and he meets a really significant person, the captain of the army. Who was the captain of the army? Jesus was the captain of the army, not Joshua. And we know that the walls of Jericho fell. And that is a magnificent story in the Bible. So Joshua brings into the promised land, and he divides the allotments for each of the tribes and where they're to be. And all the tribes were allotted in the midst of Israel, and 2 of the tribes, the Gadites and half tribe of Manasseh, they were on the outside of the promised land. But that's another story too. But Joshua, in the midst of all of this battling and such, becomes such a wonderful leader as to leading them into the promised land. Okay, Joshua dies, and some of the elders rule at that time. Well, then they have judges. Now, we don't have kings yet. We have the judges. And, of course, the people, without a leader like Joshua, where Joshua would say, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. I don't know where are you going to serve? Are you going to go back to Israel and serve those gods? But I'm going to serve the Lord. Well, they went away from the Lord, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But then God did cry out to God, and God would raise up a leader, a judge. Not a king, but a judge. And there were 14 judges. Let's see these 14 judges there. We have Othniel, we have Ehud, we have Shamgar, we have Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Eli, Elan, and of course the last judge was Samuel. And as you go through these judges, there's stories about each one of them. We know that, Ehud killed King Eglon, which was a Moabite. He was a very fat man. But he went in and Ehud, being left-handed, stabbed him. Oh, okay, that's kind of a gross story. And then we know we have Deborah, and Deborah being a prophetess, and she went in with, the leader was Barak, and they fought the battle on Mount Tabor and won as God showed up and the enemy's chariots got stuck in the mud. What an amazing story. As we go through each one, another one is Gideon, and there's many stories about Gideon, as Gideon's army was so small and defeating, like 300 in his armor, defeating 135,000 of those Midianites. Oh my goodness. And Gideon's army going in with their weapons being basically they held a clay pot with a lantern inside and a trumpet. So they, in the midst of the night, they would break their pot and the lights would shine all over, and then they'd trumpet the word of God, or trumpet for Gideon's God. It really, really mixed up the enemy, and they ended up killing each other. But isn't that the way it is with us? Because we are like those clay pots, and when we're broken in the midst of our broken times, God's light shines through us too. Isn't that amazing how all of these things point to the present time in our walk with God? How cool. And especially when we trumpet the gospel every place we go. Oh, I like that. So we go on and down into Eli being not the greatest of judges we know, and then on to Samuel. But then we forget there was one more judge, and it was Samson. Well, Samson was of the tribe of Dan. There's 300 years in the midst of all of this time, and all of these judges in the time that they were judged would not fit. But if you take Samson and overlap the tribe of Dan with the ruling of the tribe of Dan, it all works. Well, Samson was not the best judge either. He really didn't even claim to be a judge himself. He didn't want to be, but he was raised as a Nazarite, and God had prepared him actually to be the first judge, I believe. But he fell in the hands of a woman, Delilah. And Samson and Delilah, you know that story. And from that point, the tribe of Dan goes back into idolatry, worshiping idols. And you see that in the book of Judges. But Samson, in the end, we know what happens. God raises him up, even though he's grinding and he's blinded and all these things. With the Philistines, they have him in shackles, and there in the midst of all, God gives his power. Thought his power was in his hair, but really his power was in the true and living God. And we see God showing up mightily from Samson. But we do see the ramifications of what happened in the tribe of Dan. Okay, and then there's, in the midst of all of this, there's a sweet little story in the book of Ruth about a Moabite woman who ends up being in the lineage of Christ, named Ruth. She goes with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law's family is actually in Moab, and she marries one of the sons, and the sons and the father died, but she stays with her mother-in-law and goes on back into the promised land, into Israel. And she ends up with a kinsman and redeemer, and through a man named Boaz in the lineage of Christ. And Ruth is blessed. And she's blessed. What a great, wondrous story, because Jesus is our kinsman and redeemer. Then, of course, we have the last judge being Samuel. And Samuel being the last judge, and we know that's when Israel cried out for a king. And as they cried out for a king, they forgot that God was really their king. And Samuel, he had 40 sons, but his 40 sons were not good, and they were not good rulers. So that was one of the reasons that they called out, Samuel, you are a judge, but we want a king. So Samuel being the last judge. And we go on to the next chapter, but we know that Samuel anointed 2 kings. The first king was a man named Saul. And he looked like a king. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was taller than everyone. He was stronger, and he looked like, he'd be the one for king. And as he anointed Saul, Saul was not the best choice. Saul kept turning away from the true and living God onto his own thoughts and ways. And we'll see that in the next chapter. But Saul ended up consulting a witch even, and going away and actually fighting with David. Well, what about David? That's the next chapter. But Samuel ends up anointing David as the king of Israel. And we see through the tribe of Judah and through David's descendants comes the Messiah, Jesus Christ. King Saul was the son of Kish, the tribe of Benjamin, and David, the tribe of Judah. And we see there's a fight between the kings. But God really has chosen David, a man after his own heart. That's how this chapter ends, and then we're going to get into the next, which has some more about the kings of Israel. And this time, hey, we're getting through time, aren't we? And we're getting through the Bible. So to study this takes a long time. I'm only giving you a brief overview. It's in your book, but I know you're studying it in your Sunday school classes, I'm sure. But each of these things actually has to do with us. Are we after God's own heart? You know, and the Bible also says that when we come to the Lord, that we are of the royal family, that God has adopted us. And so here we are. We are daughters and sons of the true and living King. And he is our King of kings and Lord of lords. And through this whole lineage has to do with the lineage of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. Well, I need to start there. So I need to stop there. But then we'll start in just a little bit again about the two kings and about the kings to come. Hey, doesn't that sound fun?